Welcome back to my channel, the best place for ambitious millennial professionals who feel stuck in their careers to find their dream careers. In my last video, I talked about how immigrants can break the glass ceiling. In this video, I'm going to focus specifically on 4 important problems that Asian immigrants deal with what we call the bamboo ceiling. But what is the bamboo ceiling? Is it real? And how is it different from the glass ceiling? And how does it affect you? Be sure to stay until the very end to learn all the important stats that will help you realize the scope of the challenges Asians face in the West. Also, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell to receive regular updates on all things related to bringing positive change to your career. Hi, I'm Dr. John Tam, and I'm passionate about helping ambitious millennial professionals build their dream careers. So without further ado, here are 4 must-know problems about the bamboo ceiling and the problems Asian immigrants face. Point number 1. Here are some bamboo ceiling stats that really show it exists. A lot of the talk about Asian Americans in academia and the public's eye has generally been on education, but there really needs to be a conversation about Asians in the workplace. Now, Asian Americans are 12% of the professional workforce, while making up only about 5.6% of the US population. In a research by Buck G and Denise Peck called The Illusion of Asian Success, Asian Americans are the least likely racial group to be promoted into Silicon Valley's management and exec levels, even though they are the most likely group to be hired into high-tech jobs. These findings are also found across white-collar professional jobs across the country for entering management, and Asian Americans are represented less than any other race, including Black and Latinos. In comparison, white professionals are about twice as likely to be promoted as their Asian American counterparts, and 3 times the number of executive jobs. If we look at New York banks, Goldman Sachs reported about 27% of its US professional workforce was Asian American, but only 11% of its US executives and senior managers were Asian. None of its executive officers were Asian. And it's not only high-tech jobs and white-collar jobs, it also applies to federal jobs as well. In 2016, Asian Americans were 9.8% of the federal professional workforce, but only 4.4% of the workforce at the highest federal levels. And so essentially what we're seeing is a trend of Asian Americans being hired. They're overrepresenting their racial group in terms of jobs, but at the same time, they are massively underrepresented in the leadership levels. Now that's the quantitative data. My second point is looking at the qualitative aspects of the bamboo ceiling, and I'm going to dive a bit into the neuroscience. Now we understand in the human mind there are basically 2 systems of thought. One is the fast brain and one is the slow brain, and I talk about the fast brain and slow brain by citing Daniel Kahneman's work in this video above here, so definitely check it out if you want. But the basic idea is we have a fast brain, which is located in our amygdala, and that's basically our fast gut reaction to certain things. And that's where all the biases come from, because a lot of times you want instant response. You don't want to think things through all the time. For example, in a car collision situation, you want an instant response on what to do. When there are dangers coming at you, you want to trigger the fight or flight mechanisms as soon as possible. You don't want to wait, half a second may cost your life. Now, the other system is the slow brain, and the slow brain is essentially what is in our prefrontal cortex. It's the logical brain, it's the cultural brain, and it helps us differentiate maybe this person is not as dangerous as my gut instinct tell me they are. Or maybe this person is more trustworthy than I thought they were. It basically allows you to recalibrate your gut response to come up with a better response that is more suited to the situation. Now, why am I telling you this? Because the fast brain is essentially the implicit bias system that's already planted there. And when we look at the research of Virginia Valian, who's a psycholinguist, a cognitive scientist, and a gender theorist for the workplace, there are a lot of implicit biases in place for Asians. And here are several that I'm sure you've definitely heard of in the past. Asians being good at math, Asians being socially awkward, Asian men being effeminate, Asian women being submissive, Asians being physically weaker, Asians having poor social skills, Asian men can't project confidence, Asians technically are competent but are not competent in terms of leadership. And another one that I see a lot in education is that Asians aren't creative since they only memorize and they can't think creatively, whatever that means, right? And I have a beef with that one because Asians, by looking at so many cases, Asians are actually pretty good at lateral and divergent thinking because there's so many cases to draw ideas from. Now, to be clear, these are all implicit biases, and these are all things that Asians have more or less established in American culture. And at the same time, when we look at Harvard's implicit association test, You can actually go, just Google implicit association test, Harvard, and go and take a test for yourself to see what your implicit biases are, your gut reactions are to certain things. I personally enjoy the test. It shows that, implicit bias exists. However, it is not proof for behavior, which is something that even its creators admit to, right? So the fact that an implicit bias exists doesn't mean that you're gonna stereotype or discriminate against that individual. Your slow brain actually kicks in and tells you maybe it's not a good idea to be racist. However, the slow brain also is very taxing on the body, which means that if the person is tired or the person is not alert or their guard is down, or if maybe they've had a little bit of alcohol or whatnot, in those situations, implicit biases that become manifested in terms of the discriminatory action may rear its ugly head. And given this kind of situation, Asian men then tend to be stuck in a lose-lose situation in the workplace. Evaluations may include, you don't speak up on the one hand, but you're too aggressive on the other. It's a situation where it's impossible to win when you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. What is assertive in a man becomes aggressive in a woman. What is assertive for a white or black man similarly becomes overboard for an Asian man. And that's for men. Female Asian Americans actually get a double jeopardy for this. So what becomes aggressive for an Asian man actually becomes shrill and out of control for an Asian American woman. And these are just problems that exist in the workplace that Asian Americans have to deal with on a daily basis. Especially if Asian American women have to fight against the submissive stereotype, right? And if you want to learn how to say no and set boundaries with tact, I actually suggest you check out this playlist here on the soft skills of saying no and setting boundaries at work. Now, there are a lot of sociological and historical reasons for all these stereotypes, right? It doesn't help that the shrill shrieking of the yellow peril, Mr. Fu Manchu, is a stereotype that Asian men were introduced into the West for. Even today, K-pop stars tend to be more effeminate than their Western counterparts with their overt makeup. In fact, the last time I checked, Korean men actually account for 90% of the makeup consumption in the world. So there's that as well. There's also a historical component to this, where the traditional success of a man in Confucian society is to study hard in the civil examinations and to eventually strike it rich as a government official. Meanwhile, in the West, the traditional marker of a man is essentially Conan the Barbarian. So in short, there are a lot of social cultural underpinnings at work here. And these are not only replicated at a societal expectational level, but even within the families themselves, right? Asian families, they're like, you better study hard, get into a top school, and etc. These social and historical factors also apply to Asian women as well, right? So the men got the Fu Manchu, but women has something else. And these are really perpetuated by Western post-war experiences in Vietnam, China, Philippines, Taiwan, and South Korea, where Western countries were really, working on containment at that time to surround communist China or communist Russia from expanding, and therefore they had to contain them and, have all those countries have military bases. And while those white men were there, they of course are lonely and they have to seek out various forms of entertainment. And where they get them, it's usually in the pleasure quarters. And basically, when you're a consumer in the pleasure quarters, of course, the women are going to be submissive to you. And in post-war Western individuals going back to America or wherever they came from will then develop a fetishization of what an Asian woman is like. And that image is further developed from the pleasure quarters and further perpetuated in mainstream media. But all this is based on a false reality. Even in the search data reported by Quartz back in 2013, they found that Asian women were the highest search category for all men on dating apps. And in case you're wondering, white men were number one. And so these kind of historical and sociological perceptions and implicit biases that people have toward Asian Americans are challenges people need to face on a daily basis. And to really build on that, the question is then, what makes for a good leader? And Virginia Valian's research has shown that typically masculine traits make for good leaders, and typical feminine traits are pluses, but not a substitute for masculine traits. So if you are hyper feminine, as Asian men and women are perceived to be, it's generally a weakness in the workplace. And we also need to understand the principle of homophily, which is people like to promote those who are similar to themselves. And implicit biases work in this way. How do you get a leadership position that is already Caucasian or white dominated when there are these forms of obstacles in before you? And essentially, this is the qualitative and quantitative data for the bamboo ceiling. What do you think about it so far? Let me know in the comments below. So my third point is, how does all this impact Asian Americans? And to be very fair, we really need to divide Asian Americans into two groups. The first group are the first generation migrants, meaning they're not born in America and they just immigrated there as working adults. The second group are Asian American 1.5 to second generation, meaning those who moved to the West at a very young age or they're actually born in the West. And these people speak fluent English and are culturally indistinguishable from Americans. And for that group, the 1.5 to second generation, I'll tackle that in the next video. So make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell for when it comes out. The first generation, when they come to America, they essentially sign something called the immigrant bargain. They will almost always take a status hit. And I've got friends who are leaving Hong Kong right now because of a variety of reasons. And a major reason why they don't want to leave is because they don't want to make the immigrant bargain. A friend of mine is raking in 200K annually at a bank in Hong Kong, and he was looking for an equivalent position at Scotiabank in Toronto. And he expected the pay bracket to, account for that, like, what is your expected pay? However, the top pay bracket that he saw was 120K. There's nothing beyond that. There's not even 120K plus. So there is always a price to pay, whether in terms of your earnings or in terms of a status hit. Another thing is first generation immigrants lack social capital. And I talked about that in my last video at length, so definitely check it out if you are interested in it. For social capital, there is already an established power structure in the West. And essentially those are old boys networks. And in those networks, if you are an Asian American and you want to climb the corporate ladder, there's several problems. There's a lack of role models. And when there's a lack of role models, there's not really anybody who can really teach you how to navigate the social landscape as an Asian American. Furthermore, even if there are role models, some of them may be hesitant to promote their co-ethnics because it may come across as them, helping similar people, and it may make them look biased. So a lot of immigrants, especially Asian immigrants, they get boxed into ethnic communities and ethnic enclaves. And really the way to break out of that and to join the primary labor market is to learn how to leverage weak ties and not rely on strong ties. And I talked a lot about that in my previous video, which I, pointed out to you guys before. So I'm not gonna point it again. But definitely check it out. Go back and check it out if it's something that interests you. Another problem that first generation Asian Americans struggle with in terms of the bamboo ceiling is cultural capital. And there's a mismatch in terms of what they see as desirable versus what the West sees as desirable. And it's the lack of understanding of cultural signals, especially when they first come over. So for example, there's something called the Duchenne smile, right? The Duchenne smile is when you smile and your eyes crinkle along with it as well. I'm not very good at it, but you get the idea, right? Now in the West, the Duchenne smile is seen to be genuine and heartfelt and sincere. But in countries where trust is lacking, or in countries in Asia, the Duchenne smile can actually come across as disingenuous or even dumb or even untrustworthy, especially if the place is unstable, right? So a lot of times when you look at resumes in Asia or people, meeting others in Asia, a lot of times they don't really smile on those pictures because they want to exude a sense of confidence or trustworthiness, and that's not through a Duchenne smile, which is seen as sincere in the West but dumb in the East. So these are things that make Asians come across as even colder than they really are. Another thing is body language. So when we look at India, for example, the head bobble is a universal in India. It's almost like a reflex. However, in the West, there is no such thing. And if you do a head bobble, people are like, what are you saying? And so once again, it gets lost in the cultural translation, and it's a learning process that needs to be done. And if someone's not really deliberate and really focused on learning and acquiring this cultural capital, it may really be one's Achilles heel when it comes to getting promoted to the next rung of the leadership ladder. Another cultural difference would be introversion versus extroversion. Chinese are taught at a young age that leaders are quiet, reliable, and solid. All the banzhang, or the class leaders, are typically the introverted ones who are quiet and reliable and get stuff done in the education system. So even when you look at the leaders in China, a lot of them, when they go on stage, they're very austere in how they present themselves. Meanwhile, in the West, you have people exuding charisma like Obama and Trump, which is a totally different brand than Xi Jinping, right? So essentially, when you look at personality traits like introversion versus extroversion, there's a different value system that's placed on them. So it's really hard for a first generation immigrant to sort through these biases and implicit associations with behavior, because these are really deeply rooted behavior systems that got them promoted in the first place to climb their social and corporate ladders in their home country so that they have the ability to immigrate to a new country. And so moving to a new country, they have to ditch all this stuff and learn a new system. It's basically very difficult. So oftentimes a lot of first generation immigrants will think about pursuing more education, and it will probably help them, because a lot of times that's actually what it's taught in the East, right? The more education you have, the more prepared you are. However, the reality is it won't, because in the West, leadership is perceived as having a lot of soft skills. And the reason why soft skills are so important is because the higher you go, the more important trust is. And when the talent pool is aplenty and people really need to pick the next person to, be the leader, then whoever has more soft skills can inspire more trust is going to get promoted. And that's where all the implicit biases and homophily comes into play. So a lot of Asian immigrants will in fact end up in a predicament where they are overeducated and underemployed, and they really fail to maximize their labor market participation, which is basically if your education is to the level of being a manager, but you're working a junior job, that's basically you're working at 80% capacity or 70% capacity. And that's a major hit in terms of your ability to perform versus what you're actually doing. If you want to learn more about soft skills and how you can really boost your soft skills, definitely check out this playlist I have here, which basically breaks down what soft skills are and how you can really boost it. You can also take a free personality test because your personality is highly related to the soft skills that you are more naturally inclined in performing. So definitely check those out as resources for you to give yourself a career boost. Now, the fourth point is this. There are economic and job market consequences. So research from Professor Reza Hasmath about the ethnic penalty has found similar results in Canada. And I talk about this at length in the video up here, so definitely check that out. But basically a summary would be that non-Caucasian groups average 25% less in their income than their Caucasian counterparts, with that spread increasing to almost 40% once people hit their 40s and 50s. And basically this also becomes a double jeopardy if the immigrant is a female. And efforts have traditionally been done in language, so helping immigrants with their language, and also helping workers get their feet through the door. And these are government initiatives or nonprofit initiatives. But little has really been done in helping Asian immigrants with their career advancement. And the situation is actually getting even more precarious now, with jobs moving towards being a temporary or contract base as a general trend. And therefore, there are systematic barriers that Asian immigrants have to overcome. And the ethnic penalty actually found that the top minority executives in mainstream companies were simply superstars for their relentless hard work and performance. So even those who are the top performers in the companies, they're seen as the exception and they're not the rule. They're there because they're clocking 80 to 100-hour work weeks and they're sacrificing everything for the company. So the bottom line is this: low social trust between the dominant majority group versus the Asian American minority group is essentially one of the main reasons why this bamboo ceiling exists. It's difficult for Asian Americans to crack because of all the biases, of all the structural things, of all the cultural things that are in the way. And so for first generation Asian American immigrants, the immigrant bargain is a tough one to pay. And really mad kudos to the first generation Asian parents to making this bargain and giving the second generation a chance to really excel in the West. But does that actually mean it's all over and like Asian American second gens don't really face a problem? No, the Asian American second generation also face a bamboo ceiling. And that's going to be the topic of my next video, the bamboo ceiling specifically for the second generation Asian Americans. So if that's what interests you, definitely click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for when it comes out. And also, like I said, there's a free, quick, and accurate career personality test, which I'll put in the details below. Also, make sure to join my Facebook group, Career Change Advice, to be in a community of people who are interested in making their careers work for them rather than the other way around. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts about this video. Also, don't forget to give it a like and share it with your network if you found this to be valuable. Take care.